We appreciate you joining us today for the 2022 John E. Pless, MD Memorial Central State Circle Lecture. That is a mouthful. We have a lot of those series here. They're a little bit hard to say. This annual lecture series really is an opportunity for us to thank our members who are at the Central State Circle or Eden-Harder Circle levels for their continued support of the museum and the old pathology building. Their generous contributions really are what have made us successful, and so we're sincerely grateful to all of our donors. And I also want to thank everyone else for being here as well. We're really glad to have you here celebrating with us today. If you're not a member already and you'd like to learn more about these membership levels, you can take a look at our website. Again, it's imhm.org. You can find more information about the different donor levels and benefits and other ways that you can support the museum, either financially or with your time and talent. So I'm going to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Richard Gunderman, who many of you know. Dr. Gunderman is a favorite at the Indiana Medical History Museum. We're delighted to have him back today to give his talk on the emotional health of Abraham Lincoln. Dr. Gunderman is a distinguished medical doctor, writer, and historian. He's Chancellor's Professor of Radiology, Pediatrics, Medical Education, Philosophy, Liberal Arts, Philanthropy, and Medical Humanities and Health Studies at Indiana University. He's also a John A. Campbell Professor of Radiology, and he's the author of more than 700 articles, 12 books, and most recently were Tesla, which was published in 2019, and Marie Curie in 2020. So thank you and welcome, Dr. Gunderman.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon. It's a treat to be here today, and I'm looking forward to this talk. I just want to say I worked with John Pless for many years. We would encounter each other in Riley Hospital, usually around the care of children who might have been the victims of abuse, or as we used to say, non-accidental trauma. Radiology plays a big role in the diagnosis of non-accidental trauma. And it was always a difficult situation, but a privilege to get to collaborate with John on the care of such vulnerable patients. I like to think that our collaboration did some good over the years. And today I thought it would be fun to think about the emotional health of Abraham Lincoln, partly because Lincoln is such a formidable figure in the history of the United States and our own state of Indiana, but also because I think understanding Lincoln well can help us understand mental illness better and perhaps move forward with a somewhat different picture of what it means for someone to have been depressed and what role that history of depression might play in their life. So I just begin by saying that the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual functions as kind of the Bible for the diagnosis of mental illness. And for a long time, depression and its treatment were seen almost as disqualifiers for people who wanted to assume positions of substantial responsibility. If we were all in person in the amphitheater at the Medical History Museum, I would ask if anybody recognizes this man, but I think today I'll just answer my own questions. Many of you recognize the former lieutenant governor and United States senator from the state of Missouri. This is Thomas Eagleton, who was named as George McGovern's running mate in the 1972 U.S. presidential contest. And many of you will know that Eagleton was found to have a history of mental illness, severe depression, multiple bouts, and in fact to have received ECT, what used to be known as electroconvulsive therapy, and he basically withdrew his candidacy.
Dr. Gunderman,
yeah.
Could I interrupt for just a moment? It sounds like maybe some folks are having trouble hearing you and are asking if you could move a little closer to your microphone.
Okay, I'll do that. I'll move my computer closer to me, and I hope that solves the problem.
You do sound a little louder to me. Hopefully everyone can hear you now. Thank you.
Good news. I hope the problem is resolved, and my apologies. So Thomas Eagleton did not go forward as the Democratic vice presidential candidate because of his history of mental illness. And I think that's a problematic view of a mental illness like depression. I think thinking about emotional health, and in particular, the emotional health of someone like Abraham Lincoln, is a real opportunity for us to follow this man's advice. This is, of course, a bust of Socrates found in Australia. Emotional health is an opportunity for self-examination. Socrates famously said, "Know yourself." Perhaps we can think about ourselves, our own challenges in life, sometimes psychological difficulties, and the way we're in the habit of responding to psychological travails. And perhaps in the course of thinking about Abraham Lincoln, we can develop a bit more humble and compassionate perspective on mental illness, which I think is good for all of us. So Abraham Lincoln, as everybody knows, was born in 1809, died having been assassinated in 1865. Of course, he was our 16th president. He often ranks either at the top or next to the top in assessments of the greatest presidents in U.S. history. Lincoln is particularly remarkable because he was almost entirely self-educated. There's quite good evidence that he never had more than 2 years of formal schooling, and that would be at the primary school level. Of course, he was president in perhaps the most difficult chapter in American history, the Civil War. And I think some people, some would say that Emily Dickinson or Walt Whitman are the greatest poets in American history. And I could be persuaded that that's so, but others think that Lincoln himself may have been America's poet in contexts like the Gettysburg Address and his second inaugural address. And I just remind everyone, I hope you've had a chance to visit Lincoln, Indiana. But of course, Lincoln spent roughly 15 years of his life in the southern part of the Hoosier state, really the most formative years of his life. So I think we're well within our rights to think of Abraham Lincoln as a Hoosier, although of course he was born in Kentucky and ended up in Illinois and then later Washington, D.C. So Lincoln was, by our standards, and I'll say more about this in a little bit, depressed, suffered from major depression at multiple points in his life. And, the definition and criteria for the diagnosis of depression are complicated. I, by the way, am not a psychiatrist, so I'm a little out of my comfort zone here, but I think it would be fair to say that depressed people experience fear or sadness with no apparent cause. And often the degree of that fear or sadness seems disproportionate to any apparent cause. Somebody who suffered the death of a parent or a spouse or a sibling or a child, would naturally be feeling quite blue, maybe even in a state of despair. But the idea with depression is in part that it doesn't seem to be related to any cause, or it seems out of proportion to any apparent cause for that darkening of outlook. And I just want to indicate that Lincoln had a good familial or genetic basis to suffer from depression. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was said to have suffered multiple spells. He would go out into the woods by himself with his gun and not return for multiple days. Lincoln's uncle, Thomas's brother, Mordecai, battled alcoholism, and I think undoubtedly was mentally ill. His three sons all suffered mental illness, and Lincoln's cousin, Mary, was admitted to what used to be called an insane asylum, and told people that she bore the Lincoln curse, that she had what we would call a mental illness that ran in the family. And then, of course, Lincoln himself suffered many losses. Now, this would have been less unusual in the early 19th century than today, but nonetheless, his younger brother Thomas died in infancy in 1812. He suffered the loss of his mother when he was 9 years old. His sister died 10 years after that in childbirth. And of course, Lincoln ultimately, I guess we would say, lost three of his sons, but two died during his lifetime. Eddie in 1850 in Springfield, Illinois, and then Willie while the Lincolns were in the White House in Washington, D.C. So Abraham Lincoln, came from a family with a history of mental illness, and suffered a number of significant losses over the course of his life. I want to talk specifically about two periods in Lincoln's life where he seems to have entered a major depressive episode. One would be in 1835. Anne Rutledge's father was the founder, or one of the founders, of New Salem, Illinois, and she, as a young woman, was thought to have been involved somehow with Abraham Lincoln. She was actually betrothed to a man who left Illinois, went to New York, ultimately never heard from again. But in the meantime, Anne Rutledge died. Lincoln attended her burial. And thereafter, his friends said that Lincoln seemed to be wrapped in profound thought, that like his father, he would wander off in the woods by himself and take his gun. And this caused a great deal of anxiety to his friends. And Lincoln himself admitted that he often felt like taking his own life. I'll mention just one other specific episode, which happened about 5 years later when Lincoln had moved to Springfield, Illinois. I hope you've had a chance to visit Springfield. This, of course, is a picture of the house the Lincolns occupied in Springfield. But in the winter of 1840-41, which was particularly severe, especially cold, Lincoln began to experience a sense of misery, hopelessness. He really didn't see a way forward for himself, and thoughts of suicide. And again, friends and associates said that Lincoln went crazy. They made sure to remove razors and knives from his home and workplace. And Lincoln, multiple times during his life, said that he felt haunted by the thought of rain falling on graves. Make of that what you will, but this seems to have had almost a nightmarish significance for Abraham Lincoln, the thought of rain falling on graves. So, there's a lot more to be said about depressive episodes during Lincoln's life, but these would be two of the most prominent. And Lincoln himself said during this episode around 1840, "I'm now the most miserable man living. Whether I shall ever be better, I cannot tell." A classic description. I hope some of you have had a chance to read what I think is one of the best, more contemporary accounts of depression, the novelist William Styron. You may remember him from The Confessions of Nat Turner, or Sophie's Choice, which was made into a film. I think Meryl Streep won her first Best Actress Academy Award for her work in that film. But William Styron penned a memoir called Darkness Visible. And he describes, I think, very compellingly, the sense of hopelessness. I see no end to this. And Lincoln is saying much the same. Whether I shall ever be better, I cannot tell. He said, "To remain as I am is impossible. I must die or be better. So a kind of fork in the road, and fortunately, Lincoln did ultimately recover, although I think he bore a melancholic disposition throughout his life. You may remember both Plato and Aristotle suggested that the philosopher would be of a melancholic disposition, people who were moved to pursue wisdom. I mean, the meaning of the term philosophy would be people of a melancholic temperament, presumably because they didn't just go from success to success, triumph to triumph, but life was sometimes a puzzle and even a burden to them. And that's what would get them thinking deeply about questions such as the meaning of life. So just to say, I think based on what information is available to us, Lincoln would qualify for the diagnosis of depression. He certainly described a depressed mood. Other people observed the same. He wasn't finding pleasure in life, a condition called anhedonia, kind of without pleasure. He was agitated, couldn't find a comfortable posture in life, so to speak. He was fatigued. He was plagued by a sense of worthlessness, and he thought a lot about death or the possibility of taking his own life. And in fact, Lincoln himself said he never dared carry a knife in his pocket. He was, I presume, afraid what he might do with it if he had one ready to hand. So, I don't want to suggest for a minute that we would ever wish melancholia, depression, despair on any human being. That's not the point at all. That depression is a fruitful stage in the development of a human being. I don't want to say that at all, but I would say that for Abraham Lincoln, his depression got him thinking pretty deeply about, I think, some very important questions. I mean, Lincoln was forced to ask himself, who am I? If I go on in life, for what might I live? What purpose, what meaning would I have in life to carry me forward? And finally, and perhaps most importantly, how would Lincoln need to change to continue living, to find some measure of peace, to get at least comfortable enough with life that he could move on? And these are, deep questions that I think people like poets and philosophers and theologians have wrestled with for a long time. And it's very important, if we take Lincoln at his word, to say that he was not afraid to die. I don't think it was cowardice, in a sense, just the fear of death that kept him going. It was the sense that he had an irrepressible desire to accomplish something while he lived. He wanted to do something in life, to make some contribution, to make a difference in the lives of others, in his community, ultimately, I guess, in the history of the United States. He himself said he wanted to connect his name with something that would redound to the interest of his fellow man. His life had to have some meaning, some purpose, and he really struggled to discern that purpose. So I want to suggest some ways that Lincoln responded to his depression. And I think herein lie important lessons for all of us. I'm not trying to suggest that anybody who is depressed can simply adopt these strategies and overcome their depression. That's not the point at all. For one thing, that would be too superficial a generalization. I don't think the same things would work for everybody. But far more importantly, many people in the throes of depression may not be able to adopt strategies or principles like this and move forward with them. But by Lincoln's own account, these were the things that helped him. And one was work. Lincoln found in his work, I think, a refuge from his dark state of mind. It was very important for him to avoid idleness. Seemed to be busy all the time. Now, sometimes he'd be sitting there thinking, other times he might be swapping stories or jokes, but he was always doing something. He decided for himself that his life was meant to help other people and that he wanted to serve some higher purpose. So it's not just that he, like a character in Albert Camus' The Plague, moved peas from one pan to another to keep himself busy. He wanted to work, but he wanted that work to be oriented toward helping other people. And as I say, serving some higher purpose. This is Lincoln, the rail splitter, of course. Another, I think, important approach for Abraham Lincoln was something like creativity. Everybody knows, but he was a notorious raconteur. He loved to share stories. He was, well, his mind was like a sponge for absorbing stories, and he seemed to have a story to tell in almost any occasion. Very often these stories were humorous, sometimes even maybe slightly bawdy. And I just want to say, Lincoln didn't so much make fun of other people typically. Often the butt of his humor was himself or people like him. So it was a very self-deprecating and maybe in a sense humble sense of humor. And finally, he liked poetry. He could be very rarely enticed to share poetry, but we know he both wrote and recited poetry on multiple occasions. So a certain element of creativity, of bringing something new to life, to the world, was very helpful for Lincoln. Furthermore, this is a characteristic described by Joshua Shank. And if there's a book I'm relying on more than any other, I think it came out in 2004, 2005, but it was called Lincoln's Melancholy. And Shank points to Lincoln's lucidity. He and many others quote William Herndon, who was Lincoln's law partner in Springfield, as saying that some people see the world ornamented with beauty, life, action, more or less false and inexact. Some people have too rosy or too glowing a view of the world. Lincoln was not like that. He crushed the unreal, so said Herndon. He crushed the unreal, the inexact, and the hollow. He was sadder than most people, but also wiser. I mean, the fact that Lincoln had plumbed the depths of despair may have enabled him to see the world and those of us in it more clearly. He could tolerate the possibility that he couldn't always count on people to do the right thing, let's say, because he had, experienced prolonged periods of hopelessness. So just a little bit about how this experience may have enabled Lincoln to excel as a leader. Again, not saying we should all wish to be depressed or wish depression on others so that we can become more effective leaders, but Lincoln, having known deep melancholy, was able to act in ways that I think obviously made a real difference in the history of our country. For example, with regard to slavery, he said slavery is based in the selfishness of human nature, but there was something else in human nature that opposed it, namely the human love of justice. He recognized when that selfishness and that love of justice came into opposition, shocks and convulsions must follow. And I don't know if it's a true story, it's perhaps apocryphal, but it's said that when Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose brother was a minister in Indianapolis for about 10 years, Henry Ward Beecher, when Harriet Beecher Stowe visited the White House, it's said that Lincoln met her and said, "So you're the little lady who started this great war." I mean, Lincoln saw in Uncle Tom's Cabin the awakening of the national conscience, particularly the conscience of women and mothers, that once people saw slavery for what it was, all good people would recoil in horror at the institution and be moved to do something about it. And of course, that's the effect he thought Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin had. Perhaps the most politically influential novel ever composed in the United States. I certainly think that to be true. So Lincoln wrote a lot, said a lot, thought about slavery. He said, as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. Anybody who can tolerate, who finds slavery intolerable, can't be a master either. Said Lincoln, this expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. Kind of don't treat others as you wouldn't want to be treated, or treat others as you would want to be treated, a couple of formulations of the so-called golden rule. So Lincoln's thought was that, based on the Declaration of Independence, liberty is a natural right of all people. There's no basis in that great document to deny liberty to anyone. If that's the case, then slavery was a cancer in the body of the United States, a cancer that had to be excised, ultimately, no matter what the cost, for the body, the nation to survive. And of course, Lincoln found his life calling partly in the work to realize the meaning of the phrase, all men are created equal. If all human beings are really equal, then huge change was absolutely necessary in the history of the United States. So a couple of longer quotes from Lincoln. I think these are really important. The spread of slavery I cannot but hate. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites, causes the real friends of freedom to doubt our sincerity, and especially because it forces so many really good men amongst ourselves into an open war with the very fundamental principles of civil liberty. Criticizing the Declaration of Independence and insisting that there is no right principle of action but self-interest. Are we human beings capable of nothing more than egoism, looking out for number one? Or can human beings join together in the pursuit of some other end? What's good for others, or what's good for the community or the nation as a whole? Lincoln was sympathetic with the latter view. One more long quote from Lincoln: our defense is in the preservation of the spirit, which prizes liberty as the heritage of all men in all lands, everywhere. Destroy this spirit, and you've planted the seeds of despotism around your own doors. Familiarize yourself with the chains of bondage, and you are preparing your own limbs to wear them. Accustomed to trample on the rights of those around you, you've lost the genius of your own independence and become the fit subjects of the first cunning tyrant who rises. Basically, the failure to defend liberty is, in a sense, an invitation to something like despotism or tyranny. Now, you might be saying, what does this have to do with Lincoln's depression? Well, I think the answer is that Lincoln, having known utter despair, utter helplessness, was, in a sense, prepared to risk a great deal in the pursuit of what he knew to be right. He knew what it was like to feel that he had lost everything, and that opened him up to the possibility of taking risks laying a lot on the line, making sacrifices in the defense of what he knew to be right. So I think Lincoln found redemption through work. This was partly in his writing, the Emancipation Proclamation, partly in his speaking, the famous Gettysburg Address, partly simply in his excellence as a leader. His work, his mission, wasn't just doing his job, it was an opportunity for something like redemption, to show that his life, and in a way, human life, could mean something. So the idea is that Abraham Lincoln was willing to endure defeat. What did he have to lose? What more could be taken from him than what he had already lost? He was willing to be humiliated. And of course, if you know anything about the caricatures of Lincoln in the popular press of the day, our own day pales by comparison in terms of the virulence of the political rhetoric, the caricature of Lincoln of the day. He could tolerate that because he saw himself as pursuing something higher than himself, the truth about human beings and human society, and the sacrifices that need to be made to create a free society. This is, you recognize one of William Blake's illustrations from the book of Job, there on the right. But when Lincoln went to New York, his famous Cooper Union speech, a person in the press said, "No man in all New York appeared more simple, more unassuming, more modest, more unpretentious, more conscious of his own defects." I mean, people were often struck. Lincoln was 6 feet 4 inches tall, towered over everyone else, but he was also exhibited an extraordinary degree of humility. Lincoln knew that he was not in charge, different from, say, the portrait of Napoleon we get in Tolstoy's War and Peace. Lincoln knew that he was not in charge, that what was happening was not an expression of his will, that larger forces were at work in his own life, his family's life, the communities of New Salem and Springfield, in the history of the United States. And knowing that, Lincoln resolved that he would do what he could do to be of service to those larger forces. From Lincoln's point of view, and again, no prescription here, but in some cases, suffering can be educational. You maybe see more clearly, as did Job in the Hebrew Scriptures book of Job. Job lost everything. And in wrestling with that faith, he came to see more clearly how he fit in the larger scheme of things. And I think Lincoln had a very similar experience that suffering could be educational and in a way therapeutic, could remind him of his true place in the world. And for Lincoln, that meant not being in charge, not being the controller or commander of history or of reality, but a participant in reality. And in fact, seeing himself and his fellow cabinet officials and the soldiers serving in the war and ordinary citizens as instruments of a larger purpose. And this is actually a line from Joshua Shank's book, viewing Lincoln through the lens of his melancholy. We see one cogent explanation. He was always inclined to look at the full truth of a situation, assessing both what could be known and what remained in doubt. When faced with uncertainty, he had the patience, endurance, and vigor to stay in that place of tension and the courage to be alone. That Lincoln had walked through the valley of death, he had known the dark night of the soul, and far from imprisoning him, shackling him, those experiences, in a sense, actually liberated him. He was capable of doing more because he saw himself in a larger scheme of things and recognized that his life was not just about Abraham Lincoln, but was to serve larger purposes. I don't want to suggest that I think Joshua Shanks is the best biography of Lincoln. It's really focused on this issue of despair or depression or melancholy. If you really want to read a great biography of Lincoln, maybe have a look at David Herbert Donald's Lincoln, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize. But Shank provides us an interesting perspective on Lincoln. And Lincoln himself said, I see in this the words of somebody with a deep faith, what you might call a deep religious faith. Lincoln never joined the church, but from my point of view, he was a person of very deep faith. He said, the will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claimed to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be, and one must be wrong. The North, the South, the Union, the Confederacy, at least one of them has to be wrong. It's quite possible both of them are wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. In the present civil war, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. And yet the human instrumentalities working just as they do are the best adaptation to effect his will. So there's great debate over Lincoln's religiosity, his interior faith life. But I see in these words someone of great faith, that there may be more similarity between the biblical character of Job and, say, Abraham Lincoln than we commonly recognize. Lincoln had lost a great deal. Perhaps he had even heard a voice from the whirlwind, so to speak, that helped him to see where Abraham Lincoln fit into the cosmic order. And that again was a liberating experience for Lincoln. So here we come to the last slide. I really think Lincoln's suffering reconnected him with a faith that he had abandoned as a young man. Back then, he was prone to ridicule people like ministers and communities like churches. But if you ever read Lincoln's second inaugural, and this has been pointed out by other scholars, but that address is only 700 words long. And in that short space, Lincoln mentions God specifically 14 times, Scripture 4 times, and prayer 3 times. This is somebody who really saw himself as an instrument of a larger power, as part of a much larger whole. And oddly enough, I find deep resonances with my own interpretation of Lincoln's understanding of his melancholy, his depression, in the works of a theologian who also wrestled with depression. When I knew him at the University of Chicago, James Gustafson, whose book Ethics from a Theocentric Perspective, I think perhaps unbeknownst to Gustafson, that's hard to imagine, but presents a very Lincolnian understanding of where we fit into the scheme of things. I think ultimately Lincoln's understanding of history, the Civil War, was not an anthropocentric understanding, not one centered on man, but ultimately a theocentric perspective. But he saw behind events the finger of God, and I think that was a perspective to which he might not have come had he not endured such deep psychological torment, such terrible suffering. But could it be that those dark periods in his life and that melancholic disposition that he bore all his life in fact, were important ingredients in the recipe for the leadership, the servant leadership that Lincoln was able to extend to the United States during the darkest chapter in its history. That Lincoln's poor emotional health in very crucial ways contributed to his wisdom. And that wisdom at that dark hour played an absolutely crucial role in excising the malignant tumor of slavery, or at least moving us far along that path, and ultimately saving the Union. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope we'll have some time for questions and conversation. I probably got some things wrong, and I hope you'll correct me. But I more so hope that you'll give some thought to Lincoln. I'm amazed how many people have no idea Abraham Lincoln ever suffered anything like melancholy or depression. In fact, it's a huge part of his life. And I think by arriving at a more balanced perspective on Lincoln and his life, we can understand this greatest of our fellow Hoosiers, and also perhaps gain some deep insight into what mental illness means for the lives of every single one of us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gunderman. That was wonderful.